So, dear friends, how is the gametic transfer taking place in a seed bearing plant like angiosperms and gymnosperms? We have seen that in lower plants like algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes, the male gamete is motile and the female gamete is non-motile. Though the motile male gamete swims through water and reaches the female gamete. But that is not the case with the higher plants or the seed bearing plants, the gymno and the angiosperms. In both gymnosperms and angiosperms, the pollen grains are the carriers of the male gametes. The eggs, the female gametes, are located within the ovule of pistil. So, you can see here, this is the structure of a pollen grain in an angiospermic plant. This pollen grain carries the male gamete as well as additional materials. Now, the female reproductive structure, that is your carpel, it carries three things: the stigma, style and the ovule, and within each ovule is located one female gamete, that is the egg cell. Now, in this case both of them are immotile, that is the pollen grain as well as the ovule, both are immotile. Pollen grain carries the male gamete, ovule carries the female gamete. Now, in this case how the gametes are brought together, that is the question. Because both the structures are non-motile, the pollen grains are transferred to the stigma to facilitate the fertilization. So, the pollen grain from the male reproductive structure should reach the stigma of the female reproductive structure. As you can see here, if the flower is bisexual, that means if it has the female and the male reproductive structures on the same flower like this, this is the example of a bisexual flower where the male and the female structures are located side by side. In this case, because the anther and the stigma are close to each other, you can see here, this is the stigma and this is the anther. Both are located side by side or close to each other, and in this case the transfer of pollen grain to the stigma is relatively easier. So, the pollen grain from here can easily be transferred onto the stigma, right. It is like this. This is the close up shot where how the pollen grains can be easily transferred onto the surface of the stigma. This is the case with a bisexual flower, right. But what about unisexuals? In cross pollinating plants, what is a cross pollinating plant? A plant which takes up the pollen grain from other plant of the same species. The pollen grains needs the help of some agent for pollinating the flower. So, in a cross pollinating plant, the pollen grains should be transferred with the help of some agents. These agents can be wind, insects or animals. That means, if this is a plant and this is another plant, suppose if this flower carries the anthers, these pollen grains are carried by say wind to the female flower that is located on another plant. Now, this female flower consists of the pistil here. So, the pollen grains from this location are carried to the stigma of the female flower through the agent wind. So, here in higher plants, both the male reproductive, the male gamete carrying pollen grain as well as the female gamete carrying ovule, both are non-motile. So, pollen grains are carried with the help of some agent like wind, insect or animal, so that they successfully reach the stigma of the female reproductive structure. Now, during this cross pollination, the plants can be monoecious or dioecious. That means, The same plant can contain both male and female flowers, or each species can have exclusive male plant and exclusive female plant. So, now you can see in this image, it is a real time image where the pollen that has landed successfully on the stigma is trying to germinate and it is forming a pollen tube. Now, let us see what happens once the pollen grain lands on the stigma. So, when the right pollen grain lands on the stigma like this is the ovule that is carrying the ovary that is carrying the ovules like this. So, if the right pollen grain lands, it tries to germination and formation of the pollen tube, right. Now, within this pollen tube, the pollen grain releases the male gamete, right. So, now through the pollen tube, the male gamete slowly reaches the female gamete. This is how the pollen, what is the fate of a pollen grain once it lands on the stigma? The pollen grain germinates on the stigma and it forms a pollen tube, right. Now, through this pollen tube, the male gamete will travel and it will reach the ovule and the egg eventually. So, this process is required for fertilization. Now, once the male gamete is successfully transferred to the ovule via the pollen tube, now fertilization takes place that results in formation of zygote. Always remember, zygote is the product of fertilization after fusion of the gamete. Now, this is the case in plants. What happens in animals? In dioecious animals, where the male and the female gametes are formed in different individuals, we discussed about what is dioecious condition. It is a male is exclusively separated from female. Male always produces the male gamete. Suppose in humans it is the sperm, and the female produces the female gamete, that is the egg. Now, when the male and female gametes are produced in two different individuals, that condition is dioecious. Animals most of the times exhibit dioecious condition, and in such organisms, how the male motile gamete reaches the egg cell, it is again a different story. So, these animals, they have evolved with special mechanisms for gametic transfer. So, ultimately what is the take home of the story? It is that in higher plants and in higher animals, the male and the female gametes, in higher plants, the male gamete is as well as the female gamete, both are non-motile. The male gamete is carried by the pollen grain, and this pollen grain cannot reach to the female gamete on its own. It takes the help of some agent, whether abiotic or biotic, so that it is successfully carried to the female reproductive structure. Now, once the pollen grain lands on the female reproductive structure, the gametic transfer is happened. The pollen grain successfully germinates within the stigma and it releases the male gamete, so that the male gamete can reach the female gamete. But in animals, they have a special mechanism for gametic transfer.